It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. Samuel Adams.
Thomas Hutchinson was appointed Chief Justice and Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. He was put in charge of enforcing the taxes put on the colonies. Little did Hutchinson know that these tax policies would ignite a revolution among the American colonists.
Since they had a common cause, the American colonists became unified and took a principled stand against the British that raised tension and set them on a path to the American Revolution.
The Stamp Act, which was passed by British Parliament on March 22, 1765, was implemented to mainly help meet the cost of the French and Indian War. Different everyday items such as colonial papers, legal documents, playing cards, and other such items were taxed. The colonists were opposed to it because they had no representation by state legislators in Britain.
In the early 1750s, France's expansion into the Ohio River Valley brought conflict with the British because they trespassed into the colonies. In 1756, the British formally declared war, marking the beginning of the French and Indian War. Although the British struggled in the beginning, tides turned when William Pitt took over wartime operations. Paying Prussia to fight in Europe, he was able to take away French focus from the war in America. In 1763, the French and Indian War ended, leaving France and Great Britain with a tremendous amount of debt. After the war, military and civilian costs had left the British at a national debt of an astonishing £140 million. The British needed some sort of source to pay back their debts, and their settlement in America was the perfect origin for the money.
After the French and Indian War, the first act that the British imposed on the colonies was the Sugar Act. It raised revenue on sugar imported goods by the colonies, basically giving the British sugar growers in the West Indies a monopoly on the colonial market. This act would enforce the already existing Molasses Act that was applied in 1733. In addition, it would also administer the Navigation Act. This act restricted the use of foreign ships for the trade between every country except England. Specifically, they prohibited the colonies from trading directly with the Netherlands, Spain, France, and their colonies. The act required all of the colonies' imports to be either bought from England or resold by English merchants, creating more profit for the British instead of the colonists. The colonists were opposed to it because it was more of a regulation rather than a tax on the people. However, the British were not satisfied with the civility of the colonists towards the two acts. They needed an act that could be imposed on everyday items, so they created the Stamp Act.
The Stamp Act was passed by British Parliament in March of 1765, but was not effective until November 1st. The Stamp Act would be put on a great variety of legal and commercial papers, such as newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, wills, college diplomas, custom house papers, and all sorts of contracts. The Stamp Act would also cause the colonies to lose crucial trade routes with the French, Dutch, and West Indies. The tax would charge a shilling for every one of the items listed, meaning that they would cost almost double without the tax. When the Stamp Act was not paid, the punishment would be up to £20, which is 400 shillings. Not only was the tax a huge cost and burden to the people, but the penalty was just as costly. Opposition against the Stamp Act was shown immediately. For example, mobs immediately began to break out. There were people outside in the streets chanting, angry taxpayers and violent protesters. The mobs showed their anger by burning an effigy of Andrew Oliver, a stamp distributor in Massachusetts Bay, while hundreds of people cheered in objection against the Stamp Act. Colonists argued that not only did they have the money because of the previous acts, but also they had no representatives in British Parliament, so the British had no right to tax them. They were worried that eventually Parliament would be able to completely control the colonists. Under these restrictions, a group called the Sons of Liberty was established. Led by the people, such as Samuel Adams, John Adams, and Paul Revere, this group became the organized base of the fight against the British. Many feared the Sons of Liberty because the tactics they used struck fear into many. For example, they used violence and threats to force stamp enforcers to resign. Also, they provided a strategic model that other colonies mirrored in opposition of the Stamp Act. Back in Britain, the government was also facing opposition from English merchants and manufacturers. They were suffering from the lack of trade brought on by the colonial non-importation agreements. The act was basically anti-trade because it taxed and burdened both British and colonial trade. Loyalists argued that the taxes were necessary to reimburse Britain for the protection of the colonies during the French and Indian War. Benjamin Franklin also argued that duties from the colonies to Britain were never opposed. Franklin said, "It has appeared to be the opinion of everyone that we could not be taxed in Parliament where we were not represented, but the payment of duties laid by the Act of Parliament as regulations of commerce was never disputed." However, after months of protest, Britain finally repealed the Stamp Act in March of 1776. This can be attributed to the influence of Parliament by several important men, the resistance of colonists, and the protests of merchants and traders of England. One person who influenced Parliament was William Pitt. Pitt, an important British figure who helped Britain win the French and Indian War, argued for the repeal of the Stamp Act. He said, "This kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies. They are the subjects of the kingdom, equally entitled with yourselves to all natural rights of mankind and the peculiar privileges of Englishmen. The Americans are the sons, not the bastards, of England." However, even though Britain repealed the Stamp Act, they passed a Declaratory Act. It asserted Parliament's power and authority to place taxes in the colonies no matter what. The colonists realized that they were being treated unfairly by the British, so under this idea, the colonists came together and took a stand against the British. For the first time in their history, the colonists learned that they could make a change.
Although the Stamp Act was repealed, the fight was far from over for the colonists. Britain still found ways to bind the colonies. Along with the Declaratory Act, Britain passed 3 more acts. These acts include the Townshend, Tea, and Intolerable Acts. The Townshend Act would create duties when importing 72 different items between the colonies and Britain. The Tea Act made it so the colonies could only purchase their tea from the East India Company, meaning that the colonists would lose ties with Europe and create more profit for Britain instead of themselves. Lastly, the Intolerable Acts include the Administration of Justice Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Quartering Act. All of these acts just asserted Britain's power over the colonists even more than before, and was implemented in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party. Specifically, the Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials to be tried in England instead of the colonies, basically making them immune. The Massachusetts Government Act repealed the Massachusetts Charter and gave William Phips, a royally appointed governor, a lot of power. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers. The repercussions of the colonists' actions against the Stamp Act created more problems for them, but it revealed the broken relationship between the colonies and the motherland.
All these events led to the colonists on a path to freedom. They began by opposing the British, and then they declared their independence. The Declaration of Independence was signed July 4, 1776. It is arguably the most important event in our country's history. Although it did not separate us from the British, it symbolically drove us in the American Revolution. Today we have the luxury of being free. We are able to govern ourselves, speak freely, make our own laws, and much more. We live during a time where the people make decisions rather than one person. For all of this, we should be grateful to those who fought for our independence, not only now, but then.